Sometimes sin sneaks up on us. Sometimes we find ourselves in the middle of things and places that we never would have imagined we would find ourselves in. And even though we can't quite figure out how in the world the journey that we took from where we started to where we ended up even took place, here we are, we find ourselves in a situation in which Peter found himself, Judas found themselves, having betrayed Jesus. Now, I'm convinced that Peter started out on that journey because he loved Jesus so much he could not imagine any good reason for ever denying him, forever forsaking him. And even though Jesus quoted the scriptures and told him that when the shepherd was struck, the sheep should scatter, Peter took that more as a challenge than a command, and he thought, oh yeah, well, I won't do it. And that led him into a courtyard where he denied Jesus 3 times. But he was not the only one to deny Jesus that night. Judas, too, had betrayed his Lord. And we have so much less about Judas. We have no idea what his motivation was. We have no idea why he betrayed Jesus. Hints, suspicions, whispers. Maybe you all have a theory. But whatever his motivation, he and Peter on that night found themselves in precisely the same place. Judas had betrayed Jesus to the governing authorities. Peter had denied knowing Jesus before men. What happens next? It seemed like when we were talking about the story of Peter, we spent a lot of time talking about what he should have done, what he might have done. But that's all about the past. What does he do after he's failed? And for that, we have to turn to the Gospel according to John. So if you do have Bibles, I'll invite you to open them to John chapter 21. Both Judas and Peter failed Jesus. Both Judas and Peter probably despaired whether or not they would ever be restored. But one of them finds himself with Jesus on the shores of the Sea of Galilee having a conversation, and the other one did not survive the night. We're going to try and look at those 2 pieces of this puzzle and try and answer the question, what happens after the wheels fall off? What happens after we have failed? Now, Judas, he commits suicide. He doesn't wait for Jesus to be resurrected from the dead, even though Jesus had prophesied that. He doesn't go to the place where Jesus had told the disciples to gather. He doesn't spend any time like that. Judas becomes so absorbed with his wickedness, so overwhelmed by his failure, that he takes his own life before he can have another conversation with Jesus. But Peter, who failed him in the same way, doesn't despair, at least not to that extent. He continues to obey after having failed Jesus. He goes to the place where Jesus said that he would meet him, and he waits. And Peter is rewarded with this conversation in John chapter 21. This is John chapter 21, beginning in verse 15. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" That must have been a hard thing to hear, I would imagine, for Peter. And Peter said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Now, before we move on to verse 18, I suspect it took Peter the 3 times to recognize what Jesus was doing. 3 times Peter had denied knowing Jesus before people to save his own life. 3 times Jesus asked him if he loved him. But what I'm more interested in is what Jesus asked Peter to do as a way of coming back. Now, Peter had failed to follow Jesus all the way because he had failed to be loyal to the scriptures and he had failed to obey Jesus. But he had also failed because of his loyalty to Jesus. He didn't like that the scriptures told him he should abandon him, so he rejected that. Peter had already followed Jesus. And even though he had failed him, he had not stopped following. He had still gone to this place where they had agreed to meet, and he was waiting for Jesus. And then when he met Jesus, he continued to meet with the disciples, and they gathered with Jesus over the course of 40 days. He was still following Jesus. But there was something he needed to do. He needed to take his eye off of himself. He needed to put it onto others. Jesus' response to Peter is, if you love me, Peter, you will start caring for other believers. If you really love me, Peter, you'll stop thinking about all that stuff that motivates Peter through the whole gospel. My faithfulness, my loyalty, my fidelity, what people think of me, whether or not I'll be a failure, right? That's all that Peter's concerned with. And he says, if you love me, you'll stop talking about yourself and recognize that I'm calling you to feed others. In fact, this is what happens in verse 18. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you'll stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, follow me. Jesus says to him, if you want to follow me, you have to stop worrying about your own holiness. And you need to feed my sheep. What does it mean to follow Jesus? For Peter, it meant that one day he would even lose that autonomy that he so valued. The ability to be strong and do what he wants and take care of himself, make his own decisions, be his own man. That's Peter all the way through. And Jesus reveals to him that when he is old, he will not have that right. That in fact, those freedoms will be taken away from him. That he'll be a man with no control. And then he tells Peter again, will you follow me? And I like Peter's response in verse 20. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, who we assume is the Apostle John writing this book, following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? What about that guy? What's going to happen to him? Is he going to have to live that way? Is this like what we all are going to have to endure? Or is this just for me? And Jesus said to him, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. What does it take to follow Jesus after we have failed him? Well, we understand for Peter that part of what it takes is a willingness to stay and wait for Jesus. Judas didn't have that. Secondly, for Peter learns that it takes a process of turning the eye off of ourselves and turning the eye onto others. That somehow to follow Jesus truly, we have to be less concerned with our appearance and our faithfulness and our steadfastness and our holiness, and we have to begin to show greater concern for the needs and the concerns of others. Feed my sheep. And somehow it is in having an eye fixed on caring for others that we will become holy and good. And then finally for Peter, it means accepting that wherever God leads, we will follow, no matter how difficult or challenging it might be. Peter fell into trouble because he was not willing to endure what he had to endure on that night, to be faithful to Jesus. He wasn't willing to look like he had abandoned his friend. He wasn't willing to be obedient. He was willing to die for Jesus, but not to live in the way Jesus had asked him to live. And so Jesus asks him again, Peter, will you follow me no matter where I lead you? And then Peter says, is this for everyone or just for me? What about him? And Jesus says to him, this is just for you. I'm asking you to follow me. Don't worry about anybody else. How can we be restored? I wish Judas had had opportunity to learn this before he gave up and quit. And many Christians do. Many Christians fail Jesus and then fail to follow him. We somehow are under the impression that perfection, never having let God down, is the goal of all Christians, to the point that if we do let him down, we might as well turn back and walk away because we never were as good as we thought we could be. But the story of Peter reminds us that there is restitution, that there's reconciliation, that there's redemption for all people. But it doesn't mean it comes at no cost to us. We have to do the hard work of recognizing why it was we failed. And I think this is what Jesus was doing with Peter, helping him to understand what had led him into sin. And Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you're going to have to live into different patterns. But Jesus doesn't act as though Peter is starting over with him. He doesn't say to him again like he did on that seashore, follow me. Peter already had followed him. Jesus restores him from where he is, and they move on together. I think that is one of the great graces of Jesus. Jesus wanted nothing more than for Peter not only to follow him, but to be entrusted with leadership in his church. What kind of grace is that? I mean, we could maybe fool ourselves into thinking that Jesus saw something in Peter that he didn't see anybody else, but I have a sense, because of the way the whole Bible goes, God's choice of Jacob, of Isaac, of Joseph, of David, that it's not about the quality of the people, but it's about what God knows he can do with someone who is sacrificed to his will. But it's going to take the hard work of recognizing what led us into sin in the first place. And we're going to have to turn away from those patterns. And if we do, I think we can find, like Peter, that Jesus is more than willing to restore us.